The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a familiar cocktail of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the sweet, dusty smell of sun-baked iron. It was the spring of '76, and Frank Miller was on the hunt. Not for anything shiny, not for anything with a warranty. He was walking the back rows, past the gleaming new John Deeres and the cherry-red Internationals that drew crowds like flies to a molasses trap. He was looking for the forgotten, the overlooked, the pieces of steel that still had good bones under a coat of rust and neglect. His eyes, narrowed against the Nebraska sun, scanned the lines of discarded plows and cultivators. Frank was a man carved from the same tough soil he worked. His hands were a roadmap of busted knuckles and calloused palms, his face tanned and creased from 40 years of squinting at horizons, praying for rain or begging it to stop. He farmed the same 480 acres his father had broken with a team of mules, and he did it with machinery that was almost as old as he was. His creed was simple. If you couldn't pay for it in cash, you couldn't afford it. In a time when the bank was becoming every farmer's silent partner, Frank Miller was a stubborn island of solvency. He spotted it near the fence line, half hidden behind a worn-out New Holland baler. A set of jewels, 20.8 by 34s. The rubber was checked and cracked, but the rims were solid. Clark Planetary's heavy-duty cast iron. They were off some old industrial loader or scraper. But Frank knew, with the certainty of a man who'd spent more nights in his shop than in his own bed, that he could make them fit. They'd be perfect for the Beast. The Beast was his main tillage tractor, a Steiger Bearcat II. It was one of the early ones from the late '60s, painted that odd Barney green before they switched to the more familiar lime. It wasn't one of the sleek, articulated giants that were starting to appear in the territory. It was a clumsy, rigid-frame brute powered by a screaming 8V71 Detroit diesel that drank fuel like a sailor on shore leave and marked its territory with a steady drip of 40-weight oil. But it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every greasy fitting belonged to him, and him alone. And with its four-wheel drive and sheer pig-iron weight, it could pull a 30-foot chisel plow through gumbo clay that would stall a lesser machine. "What you looking at that junk for, Frank?" The voice was slick, confident, and dripped with the kind of condescension that set Frank's teeth on edge. He didn't have to turn around to know it was Richard Peterson. Rich had bought the old Swanson place next door 2 years ago, leveraging himself to the hilt to acquire another 1,000 acres. He was young, ambitious, and farmed with a checkbook and a brand-new fleet of green paint. Frank stood up, wiping his greasy hands on an already stained red rag. "Just lookin', Rich." Rich sauntered over, his new Tony Lama boots kicking up dust that wouldn't dare settle on his pressed jeans. He gestured with a thumb back toward the front row of the auction. "You should see the new 8630 I just took delivery of. Traded in the 4630. Thing's a monster. Air ride seat, stereo, air conditioning. Got her hooked up to a 235 disc. We'll be done with planting before you even get that old green dinosaur of yours started." Frank just nodded, his gaze fixed on the planetary hub of the jewels. He could see the fabrication in his mind already, cutting a new plate, drilling the bolt pattern, welding it up solid. Rich wasn't finished. He enjoyed an audience, and a few other farmers had drifted over, curious. "Seriously, Frank, it's 1976. You can't make money turning wrenches all spring. The bank is practically giving money away. You gotta upgrade. That thing—" He gestured vaguely in the direction of Frank's farm. "It belongs in a museum." A few of the onlookers chuckled. Frank felt a slow burn in his gut, but his face remained a stony mask. "She still pulls," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Pulling isn't the same as making a profit," Rich shot back, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Time is money. While you're wrestling with that antique, I'm covering 160 acres a day. How many you cover?" Frank didn't answer. He knew the numbers. On a good day, with the Steiger running right, he could maybe work 80 acres. Rich was right about the speed, but Frank was thinking about a different kind of number, the one on the loan document Rich must have signed, the one that came with a due date and an interest rate. The auctioneer started calling for the row Frank was in. He ignored Rich, walked up to the auctioneer's truck, and registered his bid for the junk jewels. He got them for $50. Rich just shook his head and laughed, walking back to his shiny new pickup truck. As Frank loaded the heavy wheels onto his old Chevy C60 grain truck, using a chain hoist that groaned under the strain, he couldn't shake Rich's words. The pressure was everywhere. It was in the farm magazines, full of ads for bigger, faster, more expensive equipment. It was at the co-op, where the talk was all about expansion, tax write-offs, and operating loans. It was even in the friendly advice from his own banker, who kept suggesting he could unlock the equity in his land to finance a new line of machinery. Everyone was running a race, and Frank felt like he was the only one standing still. He looked at the $50 duels, then at his own gnarled hands. He was betting on himself, on his own skill and sweat, against a system that was betting on debt. It was a lonely wager to make. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening to this. Put yourself in Frank's boots for a minute, back there in '76. You're watching your neighbors get rich on the bank's money, driving new tractors with air conditioning while you're sweating and wrestling with old iron. Do you stick to your guns and stay debt-free, even if it means falling behind? Or do you sign the papers, take the risk, and join the race for bigger and better? Drop a comment down below and let me know what you would have done. I'm real curious to hear what you all think. The planting season that year was a battle from the start. A wet April had compacted the soil, turning Frank's fields into something resembling a concrete slab. It was the kind of ground that separated the men from the boys and the tractors from the toys. It was work for the old Steiger. Frank had spent 2 weeks in the shop getting his $50 auction duels mounted. It was a dirty, brutal job. He'd used the cutting torch to slice off the old mounting flanges, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning paint and rust. The shriek of his angle grinder echoed across the yard for hours as he smoothed the cuts, showering himself in a spray of orange sparks. He fabricated the new mounting plates from half-inch steel, painstakingly laying out the bolt pattern from a template he'd made out of cardboard. He drilled the holes on his ancient, massive drill press, the bit screaming and smoking as it chewed through the thick plate, liberally doused in cutting oil that dripped onto the concrete floor. The welding was the final critical step. He laid down thick, clean beads with his Lincoln arc welder, the bright flash forcing him to squint even through his helmet. The smell of burnt flux hanging in the air. When he was done, he painted them Steiger green, a near-perfect match he'd mixed himself. They looked like they'd been born there. He bolted them on, torquing the massive 1-inch studs with a 4-foot cheetah bar until the veins stood out on his neck. The Steiger, now shod with 8 matching tires, looked even more formidable, a true monster of the plains. He fired up the 8V71 Detroit. The 2-stroke diesel didn't so much start as explode to life in a cloud of blue smoke and a deafening roar that rattled the windows of the machine shed. It was a sound of pure, raw, mechanical power. No turbo whistle, no electronic refinement, just the clatter and scream of 8 pistons hungry for work. He dropped the 30-foot chisel plow into the hard-packed earth and pushed the throttle forward. The Detroit bellowed, the duels dug in, and the old beast leaned into its collar. The steel shanks of the plow ripped through the compacted soil, turning over huge slabs of black dirt. It was slow, grinding work. First gear, low range. The tractor shuddered and groaned, but it never quit. Frank wrestled with the steering wheel, his shoulders aching by midday, the heat from the transmission cooking his boots. There was no air conditioning, just a cab that acted like a greenhouse and a coating of fine dust on everything. One afternoon, in the far corner of his north section, it happened. There was a loud bang from the right front wheel, a sickening lurch, and then a grinding noise that vibrated through the entire frame of the tractor. Frank knew that sound. It was the sound of broken steel. He killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. He climbed down, his heart sinking into his stomach. A dark, thick river of 90-weight gear oil was pouring out of the planetary hub, pooling in the fresh dirt. He sat on the plow hitch, his head in his hands. He was 2 miles from the house, his main tractor crippled, and 160 acres of concrete hard ground left to plow. The planting window was closing fast. Just then he heard the purr of a modern diesel. Over the rise came Rich Peterson in his John Deere 8630, pulling his disc at a clip that seemed impossibly fast. The cab was sealed tight, and Frank could just make out Rich's silhouette inside, cool and comfortable. Rich slowed as he passed on the road, taking in the scene. Frank sitting dejectedly, the pool of oil spreading under his crippled machine. Rich didn't wave. He just tapped his horn, a short, mocking little toot, and accelerated away, leaving Frank alone in a cloud of dust and the bitter taste of failure. The community wasn't any kinder. Word traveled fast, as it always does in a small town. The talk at the grain elevator was that Frank's old relic had finally given up the ghost. "Heard the whole front end fell out of that old Steiger," one farmer said, stirring his coffee. "Should have traded that thing off years ago. Stubborn fool." "Peterson was done planting last week," another added. "That's what you get with new equipment. Reliability." Even his banker, Mr. Harris, called him. "Frank," he said, his voice oozing false sympathy, "I heard you had a little trouble. You know, it's not too late. We could have you in a new case or a John Deere by the end of the week. We've got some very attractive financing options right now." "I'll handle it, Jim," Frank said, his voice tight. "Don't be proud, Frank. This is a business. Downtime costs money." "I said I'll handle it." He hung up the phone, the silence of his workshop pressing in on him. For the next 4 days, Frank lived in that workshop. He wrestled the massive tire and rim off by hand, using pry bars and a sledgehammer. He built a heavy A-frame hoist to lift the entire planetary hub and axle assembly off the tractor. It weighed close to 1,000 pounds. When he finally got the cover plate off, the smell of burnt gear oil filled the shop. The diagnosis was just as he'd feared. The Sun gear was missing half its teeth, and the planetary gears themselves were chewed to pieces. The fragments had destroyed the bearings and seals. It was a catastrophic failure. The local parts dealer just laughed when he told him what he needed. Parts for a Clark axle out of a '68 Steiger. "Frank, you'd have better luck finding a hen's tooth. We don't even have a parts book that goes back that far." So Frank did the only thing he could. He got out the phone book and started calling salvage yards. He found one 3 hours away, in Grand Island, that thought they might have an old Michigan loader with the same axle assembly. The next morning, before the sun was up, he was in his old Chevy truck heading west. He spent the entire day in a field of rusting iron, climbing over mountains of junk, his hands getting cut and scraped. Finally, he found it, half buried in mud. The loader had been burned, but the axle housing looked intact. He paid the yard owner $200 and spent another 4 hours with a cutting torch and a set of heavy wrenches, removing the planetary hub in the hot sun. Back in his shop, covered in grease and grime, he meticulously disassembled both the burned unit from the salvage yard and his own broken one. He cleaned every single part in a solvent tank until it gleamed. He measured every gear, every shaft, every bearing with a micrometer. He found enough good parts between the two to rebuild one solid unit. He lapped the gear faces by hand, used a press to install new bearings and seals he'd managed to cross-reference at the Napa store, and carefully reassembled the entire hub. It was a masterclass in mechanical improvisation. It was work that no modern dealership mechanic was trained to do. It was a skill born of necessity, a testament to a time when farmers were mechanics and fabricators, not just operators. A week after the breakdown, a week of 16-hour days filled with sweat, fire, and steel, the Steiger roared back to life. Frank finished his plowing, planted his corn, and met the deadline by the skin of his teeth. He was exhausted, he was behind his neighbors, and he was the subject of local ridicule. But as he looked out over his newly planted fields, he felt a grim satisfaction. The repair had cost him $250 in parts and a week of his own labor. A new tractor would have cost him $60,000, plus interest. He didn't know it then, but that week of struggle was an investment. A down payment on his own survival. The next few years were a golden age for American agriculture. The world was hungry, and the American farmer was there to feed it. Grain prices, fueled by massive sales to the Soviet Union and rampant inflation, shot through the roof. Corn hit $3 a bushel, then $3.50. Soybeans went to $7, then $8. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre in 1972 was suddenly worth $2,000. A wave of intoxicating prosperity washed over the heartland, and farmers who had once been cautious and conservative were suddenly flush with cash and intoxicated by optimism. The mantra from the Department of Agriculture was plant fensero to fensero, and the banks were more than happy to provide the capital to do it. Richard Peterson rode that wave like a champion surfer. He was the golden boy of Henderson County. The soaring value of his land gave him immense collateral, and he leveraged every penny of it. He bought another section to the north, pushing his operation to over 2,000 acres. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 8630 for the brand new 8640, with more horsepower and a quieter SoundGuard body cab. He bought a second combine, a massive International Harvester 1480 axial flow, so he could run 2 machines during harvest. He erected a new 80 by 200-foot machine shed, a gleaming monument of steel that dwarfed his house. He put up new grain bins with automatic augers and dryers. His farm wasn't just a farm anymore, it was a state-of-the-art agricultural enterprise featured in a glossy spread in the Nebraska Farmer magazine. Rich himself traded his pickup for a new Lincoln Continental and built his wife a sprawling new ranch-style house with a swimming pool. At the co-op diner, he would hold court, explaining his philosophy. "You can't be scared of debt," he'd proclaim, sipping his coffee. "Debt is a tool. It's leverage. You use the bank's money to make more money." "Guys like Frank Miller," he'd say, sometimes when Frank was sitting right there at the counter. "They're stuck in the past. They're thinking about saving dimes while I'm making thousands." Frank listened, but he didn't change. The good prices were good for him too. For the first time in his life, he had significant money in the bank. But he didn't see it as a license to spend. He saw it as a buffer, a wall against the uncertainty that he knew was always lurking just over the horizon. Farming was a cycle, and he knew that 7 fat years could be followed by 7 lean ones. His father had taught him that. The Depression had burned that lesson into his family's soul, so Frank used the profits from the boom years not to expand, but to consolidate. He made the final payment on the farm's mortgage, walking out of the bank with the deed in his hand, free and clear for the first time in his family's history. He bought a newer combine, a well-maintained but still used John Deere 7700, paying the seller with a cashier's check. He replaced the worn injectors on the Steiger's Detroit diesel and put a new set of BF Goodrich tires on it. He put a new roof on the barn and poured a concrete floor in his workshop. The rest of the money, a substantial sum, he put into certificates of deposit at the bank. His neighbors saw his caution as a lack of vision. They saw his discipline as fear. "Can you believe it?" Rich said to anyone who would listen. "Frank's sitting on a gold mine, and he's afraid to dig. He could own half the county if he wanted to, but he's content to patch up that old junk and squirrel his money away." One afternoon, Frank ran into Rich at the parts counter. Rich was picking up a box of expensive-looking electronic sensors for his new combine. He looked at the simple hydraulic filter Frank was buying and shook his head. "Still trying to keep that museum running, I see." "She runs," Frank said quietly. "Yeah, but for how long?" Rich leaned against the counter, lowering his voice into a confidential man-to-man tone. "Frank, I'm telling you as a friend. You're missing the boat. The interest rates are still manageable, and the tax depreciation on new equipment alone makes it worth it. You got to grow. In this business, if you're not growing, you're dying." Frank just nodded and paid for his filter. "I like to sleep at night, Rich," he said, and walked out. He did sleep well. He had no debts. His land, his house, his machinery, it was all his. He owed no man a thing. But as the 70s drew to a close, a chill began to creep into the air. On the radio in his workshop, while he was grinding valves for his old Ford pickup, he heard a news report. The president had appointed a new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a stern-faced man named Paul Volcker. The report said he was determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. Frank didn't know much about economics, but he knew the words, "no matter the cost," usually meant someone was about to get hurt. The interest rate on his CDs at the bank ticked up to 10%, then 11%. Mr. Harris, the banker, wasn't so jovial anymore. He seemed stressed, his smile tight. The letters from the bank offering easy credit became more frequent, more desperate. Late one autumn evening, as Frank stood on his porch watching the sunset, he looked across the road. The lights in Rich Peterson's massive new machine shed were blazing, casting long shadows across the yard. Frank could see silhouettes moving inside, probably mechanics working late to keep the complex new machinery running for the next day. It looked like an empire over there. But Frank knew it was an empire built on paper, an empire held together by promissory notes and the fragile assumption that the good times would last forever. The wind shifted, blowing out of the north, and it carried the first cold bite of winter. A storm was coming. Frank could feel it in his bones. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't in the sky, but on the ticker tape at the Henderson County Co-op. In the fall of 1979, after a decade of relentless upward momentum, the grain market stalled, then faltered. The whispers started around the coffee pot. The president had embargoed grain sales to the Soviet Union. A market that had seemed insatiable was suddenly cut off at the knees. Corn, which had been flirting with $4 a bushel, tumbled back toward $2.50. The shockwave was palpable for men like Rich Peterson, who had based their 5-year plans and loan payments on $3 plus corn. It was like the ground had vanished from under their feet. The second sign came from the banks. Paul Volcker's war on inflation was not a distant headline from Washington. It was a letter in the mailbox. The prime lending rate, the bedrock upon which all operating loans were built, began a terrifying climb. 8% became 12, 12 became 15. By the spring of 1981, it was cresting an unimaginable 20%. The easy money that had fueled the boom years had become a venomous serpent, coiling around the neck of every farmer who had taken the bait. Frank saw the change in Rich Peterson's face before he saw it anywhere else. The easy, confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, strained look around the eyes. The new Lincoln Continental was often parked at the bank for long stretches. The lights in the massive machine shed, once a beacon of prosperity, now seemed to burn with a desperate, frantic energy. One day, Frank saw Rich's John Deere 8640 sitting in his own yard, the hood up, a dealership service truck parked beside it. The mechanic, a young kid in a clean green uniform, looked baffled, holding a complex wiring harness in his hand. Later that week, Frank ran into the mechanic at the diner. "What was the trouble with Peterson's tractor?" Frank asked over a cup of coffee. The kid sighed, pushing his cap back. "Quad-range transmission controller. It's an electronic module. Thing just quit talking to the hydraulic valve body. We can't even get the part. It's on back order for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, he repeated, shaking his head. And the module itself is $1,200. Can you believe that? $1,200 for a little box of wires. Frank just nodded, picturing the simple, heavy-duty gear levers and mechanical linkages in his old Steiger. Nothing electronic to fail. If a linkage broke, you could weld it. If a gear stripped, you could replace it. You didn't have to wait 6 weeks for a $1,200 magic box from a factory 1,000 miles away. The real trouble for Rich came during soybean harvest that fall. It was a wet, miserable season. The fields were soft, and every day was a race against the next rainstorm. Frank was out in his old John Deere 7700, chugging along steadily. It was a smaller machine, with a 16-foot header, but it was light enough to stay on top of the muddy ground, and simple enough that Frank could keep it running himself. One afternoon, he saw Rich's massive International 1480 axial flow combine sitting silent in the middle of a half-cut field. It was a beautiful machine, a titan of the harvest, but it was listing to one side, buried up to its axles in a wet spot. Rich had tried to power through, relying on the machine's sheer size and horsepower, and the mud had swallowed it whole. Frank watched from the road as Rich and a hired hand struggled with chains and cables, trying to hook it to the big 8640. The articulated tractor spun its 8 huge tires, digging itself deeper into the mire, its sophisticated engine purring uselessly. Frank drove his old Steiger out to the field. The duels he'd mounted years ago were caked in mud, but they gave the tractor a wide, stable footprint. He didn't say a word. He just backed up to the front of the stranded combine, hooked on a heavy 3-inch tow rope, and engaged the clutch. The 8V71 Detroit didn't purr. It screamed. It was the raw, ugly, deafening sound of pure mechanical torque. Black smoke billowed from the straight pipe exhaust stack as the 8 big tires clawed at the mud. The rope went taut, groaning under the strain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a great sucking sound, the combine lurched forward. Frank didn't stop. He dragged the mud-caked behemoth, all 30,000 pounds of it, clear across the field and onto solid ground at the edge of the road. Rich walked over, his face a mask of exhaustion and humiliation. He was covered in mud from head to toe. "Thanks, Frank," he mumbled, not meeting his eyes. "Ground's soft," was all Frank said in reply. He unhooked the rope, coiled it back on his tractor, and drove away. He didn't need to say anything more. The sight of the $1 million operation being rescued by the $50 auction wheels and the obsolete green tractor was a sermon more powerful than any words. The first cracks in the empire were no longer hidden. They were deep, muddy ruts for the whole county to see. The foundation of modern, leveraged farming was proving to be nothing but soft ground. The winter of 1982 was the breaking point. With commodity prices in the gutter and interest rates in the stratosphere, the math simply no longer worked. The letters from the bank stopped being friendly offers and became terse demands. Foreclosure notices, once a rarity reserved for the most hapless operators, started appearing in the legal section of the county newspaper like obituaries after a plague. Farm auctions became a weekly event. Grim gatherings where neighbors watched silently as a lifetime of work was sold off to the highest bidder. These weren't retirement sales, they were funerals. The biggest funeral of all was scheduled for the first Saturday in March. The sale bill, printed on cheap pink paper and tacked to the bulletin board at the co-op, read, "Complete Dispersal Auction, Richard Peterson Farms." It listed it all. The John Deere 8640, the 2 IH combines, the full line of tillage equipment, the grain trucks, the shop tools. Everything. Frank went to the auction. He didn't go to bid, and he didn't go to gloat. He went because it felt like something he was supposed to witness, a final chapter he needed to see for himself. The yard that had once been a showcase of modern efficiency was now a chaotic jumble of machinery tagged with auction numbers. The crowd was huge, but quiet and somber. They were vultures, perhaps, but reluctant ones. Many of them were just one bad harvest or one interest rate hike away from being in Rich's shoes. Rich was there, standing by the porch of the new house he was about to lose. He looked like a ghost. He'd lost weight, and his expensive clothes hung on him. His wife was nowhere to be seen. He just stared out at the crowd, his eyes hollow, as the auctioneer's fast, rhythmic chant began to dismember his life, piece by piece. The John Deere 8640, which had cost Rich over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $32,000. The big combines went for a fraction of their value. The prices were brutally low because the only people with cash were men like Frank, and they weren't in an expansionist mood. The rest were broke, unable to even dream of bidding. The banker, Mr. Harris, stood beside the auctioneer's truck, his face grim, ticking off each sale on a clipboard, calculating how deep the hole was going to be. Frank watched it all, his heart a heavy lump in his chest. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. It was the result of a system that had encouraged good men to gamble with everything they had. A system that had promised them the world and then changed the rules in the middle of the game. While the auction was grinding on, Frank was making his own preparations. His survival wasn't based on luck. It was based on the principles he'd never abandoned. His operating costs for the year were minimal. He needed fuel, seed, and fertilizer. He paid for it all with a check, drawing from the savings account that was now, ironically, earning him 15% interest. While Rich's debt was eating him alive at 20%, Frank's cash was quietly working for him. His machinery was ready. He had spent the winter in his shop, as always. He'd torn down the transmission on the 7700 combine, replacing a noisy bearing himself for a cost of $30 and his own time. A dealership would have charged $2,000. He'd put new sleeves and pistons in the old Chevy grain truck's 366 V8 engine, a job he'd done a dozen times before. The Steiger, his old faithful beast, just needed an oil change and a grease job. It sat in the shed, paid for, ready for another season. It asked for nothing but fuel and a firm hand on the wheel. As the auction wound down, Frank saw the toll it had taken. Farmers he'd known his whole life were walking away with their heads down, their shoulders slumped. They had gambled and lost. Frank had refused to play the game, and by standing still, he had won. but it felt like a hollow victory, won on a field of his neighbor's ruin. He looked at his own calloused hands, the hands that had fixed the broken planetary, the hands that had turned the wrenches and laid the welding beads. They were the hands of a survivor. In a world that had come to worship the slick magic of finance, the old, greasy skills of the mechanic and the fabricator had proven to be the only magic that was real. The final items to be sold at Rich Peterson's auction were the parcels of land. The crowd thinned out, leaving only the serious players, out-of-state investment groups, and a few of the older, more established farmers who had weathered the storm. The home quarter, the 160 acres with the new house, the massive machine shed, and the swimming pool came up on the block. The auctioneer started the bidding high, but the response was sluggish. The fancy house and the oversized shed were liabilities now, expensive to heat and maintain, symbols of an era of excess that was brutally over. The bidding stalled at a price Frank knew was well below what Rich still owed the bank on it. He saw the flicker of panic in Mr. Harris, the banker's eyes. He saw the final shred of hope drain from Rich's face. Rich was going to lose his home, his farm, everything, and still be left with a mountain of debt. Frank had never intended to buy land. He had enough. 480 acres was more than one man could handle right. But watching this final, humiliating blow, something shifted inside him. He thought of Rich's mocking words at that first auction years ago, but there was no anger left, only a profound sadness. He thought of his own father and the lessons of the Depression. You don't kick a man when he's down. You just don't. He raised his hand. A ripple of surprise went through the small crowd. Frank Miller, the man who never borrowed, never expanded, was bidding. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I have a new bid," he shouted, pointing at Frank. Another bidder, an investor in a suit, raised him. Frank countered. The back and forth was short and tense. Frank knew his limit. He knew what the land was worth for production, not for speculation. He knew what he had in his savings. He made his final bid, a solid, fair number, and then stood perfectly still. The man in the suit shook his head. The auctioneer chanted, "Going once, going twice," and the gavel fell. Sold, to Frank Miller. Frank didn't feel a thrill of victory. He felt the immense weight of what he had just done. He walked over to the clerk's table and wrote out a cashier's check for the full amount, draining his savings down to almost nothing. He had just traded his hard-won financial security for a piece of his neighbor's broken dream. Later that evening, after the last of the trucks had rumbled away and an eerie silence had fallen over the Peterson place, Frank drove his pickup into the yard. Rich was sitting on the steps of the empty machine shed, a solitary figure in the twilight. Frank got out and walked over, holding a set of keys in his hand. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything about debt or old iron or foolish pride. "Rich," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "I didn't buy your home to put you out of it." Rich looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a weary confusion. "What?" "I'm going to need someone to look after the place," Frank continued, choosing his words carefully. "And I'll need some help in the field this year. My boy's still in school. I can't run this place and mine too. I'll rent the house to you and your family for $1 a year, and I'll pay you a fair wage to help me farm this ground. We'll get you back on your feet." For a long moment, Rich just stared at him, speechless. The golden boy, the high roller, the man who had mocked Frank's old-fashioned ways, was being offered a lifeline by the very man he had scorned. Tears welled up in Rich's eyes and streamed down his dusty cheeks. He tried to speak, but only a choked sob came out. He buried his face in his hands. Frank set the keys down on the step beside him. "We'll start tomorrow," he said softly, and walked back to his truck, leaving Rich alone with his tears and the first glimmer of a grace he never expected. Word of what Frank had done spread through the county faster than a prairie fire. At the co-op diner, the conversations changed. The farmers who had once chuckled at Frank's museum pieces now spoke his name with a kind of reverence. They saw that his stubbornness wasn't just about being cheap. It was about a deeply held philosophy of independence. His caution hadn't been fear, it had been wisdom. In a community shattered by the farm crisis, Frank Miller became a symbol of survival, a rock in a turbulent sea. Men started coming to his workshop, not to mock, but to ask for help. Frank, My old 4020 is making a noise in the rear end. You got any idea what it could be? Or, Frank, can you weld this cracked loader bucket for me? The dealership wants a fortune for a new one. He never turned anyone away. Rich Peterson worked for Frank for 5 years. They farmed both places together, using Frank's old, reliable machinery. The Steiger Bearcat, with its screaming Detroit, ploughed the fields Rich had once raced across in his air-conditioned Deer. It was a humbling education for Rich. He learned the art of repair, the satisfaction of bringing a broken piece of machinery back to life with his own 2 hands. He learned the difference between an operating cost and a capital investment. Most importantly, he learned the value of a debt-free night's sleep. Eventually, he saved enough money to buy a small farm of his own, farther down the county, and started over, this time with cash and caution. He and Frank remained friends for the rest of their lives. Years passed. The farm economy slowly recovered. Frank's son, Tom, came back from college with a degree in agronomy but a heart for the workshop. He married and had a son of his own, a boy named Daniel. One crisp autumn afternoon, when Daniel was about 10 years old, Frank found him in the machine shed, staring up at the Steiger. The old tractor was mostly retired now, used only for the heaviest jobs, but Frank kept it in perfect running order. It sat in the corner of the shed like a sleeping king, its faded green paint bearing the honorable scars of 1,000 battles. "What do you think, Grandpa?" Daniel asked, running his hand over one of the massive dual tires. Frank leaned against the workbench, a faint smile on his weathered face. "I think she's earned her rest." "Dad says you saved the farm with this tractor," Daniel said. "Well," Frank said, picking up a clean rag and wiping a spot of grease from the planetary hub. "This tractor and a little bit of common sense. Let me tell you something, son. It's easy to get impressed by the new and the shiny. It's easy to believe that faster is always better and bigger is always stronger." He paused, looking his grandson square in the eye. "But this old tractor taught me a different lesson. It taught me that what you own outright is always better than what the bank owns on you. It taught me that the skill in your hands is worth more than a line of credit. And it taught me that the race isn't always won by the fastest runner. Sometimes it's won by the one who knows the ground he's standing on and has the patience and the strength to just keep pulling when everyone else has spun their wheels and dug themselves into a hole." He tossed the rag onto the bench and clapped a heavy, calloused hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Never forget that," he said. "It's the most important thing I can teach you." Frank Miller farmed his land until he was well into his 80s. He never bought a brand new tractor. He never built a giant machine shed or a swimming pool. He died in the same house he was born in, owing no one a single dime. On the day of his funeral, the little country church was overflowing. Farmers came from 3 counties around to pay their respects, not to a man who got rich, but to a man who stayed true. And as the procession drove out to the cemetery, it passed by the Miller farm. Sitting in the yard, polished and gleaming in the afternoon sun, was the old Steiger Bearcat. Tom had pulled it out of the shed that morning, a final silent tribute to the man and the machine that had weathered the storm together. It stood there not as a relic of the past, but as an enduring monument to the simple, powerful truth that the real strength of a farmer is not in the size of his loan, but in the soil under his feet and the iron in his soul.